I just wanted, as we start off here, to make a little remark about something I said this morning with regard to a cable television connection if you can't pay your bills. And there's a reason that I said that. Because when I first got into the ministry, I was real idealistic. I mean, I thought I was going to, quote, make a difference and make an impact and help people. And I thought that my main job was just to go around and give people financial aid instead of studying and teaching. I've come a long way. But one of the things that at first made me realize that I was in the wrong business was because I would go into homes to give financial aid from a church. And as I would go into these homes, some of them were pretty nice, and they were collecting money from the welfare system and so forth. And their fridge would always have food, sometimes more than my fridge. They always seemed to have lots of beer. They always had their cigarettes, and their kids never I saw kids who, with so-called the food stamps and the welfare food, have food fights with it. But the thing that grated me the most was that I would leave through the living room after having delivered my goodies to these people who were having better than I. They would have a big television with cable. And I would always have this little ditty with the rabbit ears. And so it just always sort of grated me. I still, don't have cable. But they were asking for a handout from somebody who didn't have cable television, and they had a bigger TV than mine. Okay, I wasn't jealous, just that I sort of got the impression that I'm helping these people cheat the system, and I was. If they wanted their food from now on, they could go out and work just like everybody else. All right, now, this is the love of money that we're talking about. And there are two extremes. On the one hand, you have people who want to beat the system simply by being lazy and asking for a handout. But the other extreme is this. There are people who have money and are tight-fisted about it. The words would probably be cheap and chintzy and so forth. The Apostle Paul says that it actually is the love of silver. It's the love of the money itself or the purchasing power. Silver in the Bible is the money of redemption. So the more silver you have, the more things you can redeem. Now, with regard to loving money, we see that it's interesting that the Apostle Paul prefixes the word phileo, because that has to do with personal love. In other words, you're looking at an inanimate object and you are loving it as though it had virtues and qualities and characteristics that clicked on the inside of your soul. Now, impersonal love, agape, means you can love something or someone despite what it is. That's the true view of money. Despite what it is, you hold it in esteem in the sense that it can purchase things. God does want us to use it correctly and so forth. But phileo means you love it as though it was God. You exercise personal love toward it, and that is a mistake. Now, we found out, therefore, that the first person that phileoed money was Lucifer. Lucifer corrupted his wisdom. In other words, he chose against God, and his creature spirit died. Now, you remember that the angels and man are created very similar in that they have a body, soul, and spirit. Their bodies are different, but they do have a body. They have a soul, and they had a place where doctrine was stored. Who was the first one who died spiritually? Lucifer was. Then, of course, Adam and Eve. What did they do? They chose against wisdom or Bible doctrine in favor of four things. One, we go backwards. Friends. You'll be as God. You can think like God or try to be as smart as God. The mind. The body, the beauty of Lucifer's body corrupted the wisdom, but then the first thing actually on the list is money. It was the love of money and what it could acquire. His merchandise corrupted Lucifer to the point of rejecting God and God's thinking in life. Now, we came to learn then that this love for money actually is in the form of two things, two English words. First of all, it's avarice. Avarice and philarguria are very similar, or covetousness, pleonexia. So, avarice means that you have a greedy desire, that you want to do something with regard to money. Number one, you want to gain it inordinately. You want to control it so that others do not get their, quote, little grubby hands on your possessions. And then you want to keep it. And it doesn't matter what you, as far as what you have to do, you're going to go to great lengths to keep that. And of course, this type of thing spills over even into a church where, well, you'll just throw the church a buck or two whenever you feel guilty, or whenever you want to buy God and bribe Him and throw a little money in the plate and say, well, God, I put in a buck. You've got to answer my prayer. That type of nonsense. That's avarice. Or, as Jesus said, beware of covetousness. Same thing. A greedy desire to have and to hold more than what should rightfully be yours, or what rightfully belongs to another. Now, there's a problem with that. And that problem is avarice, covetousness, and the love of money is a sin. It manifests itself in two ways. Take the first 5 of the 10 Commandments, and they have to do with prohibitions against wronging God. The last 5 against wronging your fellow man. So if you are covetous or love money rather than God, that becomes idolatry. The second thing is you are actually wishing evil upon your neighbor. Now, what do we mean by that? Evil is the best of life apart from God. But if you're not going to the true God for your source of blessing and wisdom, you have to go to a false god. Therefore, it becomes idolatry. Money becomes your god. Secondly, against others, you have to begin using others, taking others, as it were, to control and manipulate your environment so that you begin to funnel all this money toward you, cheating them out of what is rightfully theirs. That is evil against your neighbor. We saw that this morning. Okay, now, we're in 1 Timothy chapter 6, and we're going to look at verse number 9. And the reason that we are there is because we are now going to begin, and this is the third installment of this lesson, but we're going to have a few more. We're now going to begin to ask some questions with regard to money. What's more important to you? God and His will, or your own will in acquiring wealth? How do you know when money is your God? We can get it right from the Greek text. Verse number 9. But they that will be rich fall into temptation and a snare, and into many foolish and hurtful lusts, which drown men in destruction and perdition. Okay? So, how do we know when money becomes our God? It's seen in the Greek word here, boulomai. It is what is called a substantival participle with regard to a present tense. Now, what does all that mean? Simply this. Anytime you have a present tense, you're talking about something that is continual or constant or ongoing in the Greek. Next, with regard to this being a participle and a substantive, you're talking about something that is a noun and a verb, something acting as a noun and a verb at one and the same time. You are, and you are being willful about something. And this willfulness indicates that you have deliberated, you have thought, you have contemplated about what is most important in your life. And you like the things that money can buy. And so therefore, you will be deliberately and constantly by your choice an ambitious little person. And that ambition manifests itself in acquiring things apart from the will of God. Did you ever ask yourself the question, what if it's not God's will for you to be rich? What if it's God's will for you to have to labor and do work 5-6 days a week and so forth? What if that is God's will for you? Did you ever ask yourself? Oh, I know all of you have been praying. Lord, make me rich. But that might not be true. What if God wants you to go to a distant country and minister to folks who don't have money, like in Africa or what have you? But see, a person who bulamai, a person who is willful about this thing, doesn't care about the will of God. They superimpose their ambitious will and purpose for their lives on the will of God and say, I'm going to override what you want from my life because it's my desire to be rich. Now, I'll give you a good example of somebody that God did not want to be rich, Jesus Christ. He didn't come and make himself a reputation so that people would throw money his way. He came and abandoned his glory, abandoned his riches temporarily so that he might show us that riches are not the main thing. Doing God's will is. Now, if God's will includes riches, it's icing on the cake. But if it does not, to say, I'm going to be rich contrary to the will of God, is to oppose the will of God for your life. That's when money becomes your God. So the answer to that is, when it is the driving force of your life to be rich, when you put your will over God's will, then you are an idolater. Now, the problem with that, and you can hold your place here as we go back to Psalms 115. Psalms 115. Now, what about Psalms 115? It is going to show us what's called the factor of resemblance. You're of your father, the devil, and the lusts of your father you will do. You tend to become like the God that you worship. Now, it's an interesting thing that when man wants to make a god, he makes him according to that element that he wants blessed, like the stone and the wood, the gold and the silver. And whenever you have that as a god, it tends to want to manifest itself in your life so that you become like that god. Now, what is a god of silver like? Cold and hard and indifferent to the needs of people. Note, chapter 15, and we'll start with verse number 4. Their idols are silver and gold, the work of men's hands. They have mouths, but they speak not. They have eyes, but they see not. They have ears, but they hear not. Noses have they, but they smell not. They have hands, and they handle not. Feet have they, but they walk not. Neither speak they through their throat. Now note verse 8. Everything about this is, it looks like a person, They've got eyes, but their eyes are fixed. They can't see the needs of people round about. They've got ears, but they can't hear the cries of those who are hurting. They can't render aid. They have hands, but they have no muscle, no movement, no animation to extend the hand to help. They've got feet. They stay put right where they are. They don't care about moving about to lift the burden of another person. A God of silver is cold and hard toward the needs of people, just like money. But now note the factor of resemblance. Verse 8. They that make them are like unto them. The more you keep focusing on this so-called God of silver, the God of silver reflects himself in your soul, so that you too become cold and hard with regard to the needs of others. Rather than helping others with regard to your money, utilizing it properly, especially for reaching people with the gospel and supporting the cause of Christ, you become cold, hard, and calloused, just like your God. Then again, if the true and living God were your God, you would be spiritual. You would have truth in the inner man, and you would begin to reflect his heartbeat and concern for others. He can hear. He can see. He does move. He does render aid. He utilizes his strength and power to help others. Now, that's what we should be like. We should resemble him. Now, let's go back to our verse here in 1 Timothy chapter 6. What happens when money is your God? The first thing that happens is we begin to resemble that. We become cold, hard, and calloused. The driving force of our life is to be like our God, is to resemble him, is to do what he does. He stands there looking pretty, but he does not help or aid anybody. He doesn't listen, he doesn't see, he doesn't render an outstretched hand in friendship, he doesn't come to you. Now, the Apostle Paul, therefore, renders a warning with regard to this. Verse number 9. They that will be rich, those that have the driving force of their life to keep that money, to clutch the money, to be cheap and chintzy all of their lives in order to have this pile of money behind them, simply to represent their God and security. What happens to them? Greek word empipto. It means to fall. Now, if you'll hold your place here and turn to the book of Romans chapter 11, we'll see this word used again. Verse number 12. Actually, it's also used in the middle part of verse number 11. Romans 11:11. What does it mean to fall? What was the one nation that has ever existed that has had more blessings than any nation that has ever existed? Israel. Yes, folks, more than America. But what happened to them? They empiptoed. They fell. Verse 11, middle part. The first fall is a different Greek word. But rather through their fall, salvation has come to the Gentiles. Verse 12. Now if the fall of them be the riches of the world, were they the head nation? Yes. They became the tail. Through a what? Through the fall. Were they on the mountain peak? Absolutely. But they did what? They fell off the cliff. Now they're down in the valley. That's what it means. And every time you begin to bullimi, to will to be rich, to superimpose your will over that of God. Now, again, I'm not saying that if God prospers us and promotes us, that's one thing. That's the only way you can be legitimately prospered. But if you go ahead of God and want things apart from His will, you fall. And that is what Paul is saying here. You actually, instead of having more, but Pastor, I cleared 20,000 on that case, 20,000. Yeah, but what was the will of God for your life? Did you do it legitimately? Or were you, in flesh number 4, were you trying to get everything that you could with regard to that? I'm not talking about, you understand, making good business deals here. If you're in business, it's your business to make money. But I'm talking about the fact that you are now walking outside the will of God just in order to advance yourself and prosper yourself. Instead of getting a blessing, you might get the money, but you actually fall from the blessed position that God has placed you into, if you will be rich, if that is the driving force of your life. Now, what happens, therefore? Still holding your place, let's go back to Matthew. Matthew chapter 4. Now, the next thing that happens is that God says, okay, you want to be rich? Let's put everything on the table. Let's show our cards. Who is more important? What is more important? Your riches or my will? The word temptation, it says you fall into temptation, means to be placed on trial for you to give the burden of proof. Are these riches legitimate? Are they in the will of God? Are you going to utilize them the way God would have you utilize them? Or are you going to sell out? The same word and the concept is used of the temptation of the Lord Jesus Christ. All right? Verse number 8, Matthew 4. Again the devil taketh him into an exceeding high mountain, and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and the glory of them. Riches, wealth beyond compare. What shall a man give in exchange for his soul? Though he gain the whole world. Here, Jesus Christ could have gained the wealth of the world outside of the will of God. He could have superimposed his will, opposed the will of the Father, and taken the wealth of the world. He was placed on trial at this point. Satan said, verse 9, all these things will I give thee if you will fall down and worship me. Get it? Fall. Go from the place of highest blessing to lowest. Jesus Christ was placed on this trial, and note what he said. Get thee hence, Satan. It is written, you'll worship the Lord thy God, and him only you'll serve. You can't serve God and mammon. Money can't be first, otherwise it excludes God. Okay, now let's look at the next thing on this side. First of all, you fall into temptation if money becomes your God, and then it becomes a snare. Let's turn to Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes chapter 5. Ecclesiastes 5 and verse number 10. The word snare there is an interesting word in the Greek. Of course, throughout both the Greek and Hebrew, there are a lot of words for traps and snares and that sort of thing. In this particular case, this word snare means a catch-22. Now, do you know what a catch-22 is? It's pretty simple. It just simply means that you have to eliminate one or the other. You cannot have both. Now, here you are, and the verse talks about a snare with foolish lust which drown men in perdition. Here is the catch-22. The picture is you have got a boat, and the boat is laden with material things, and a storm comes. Now, you remember the storm in the book of Acts whenever the Apostle Paul was on the boat. What did they do in order to help them float? They threw the cargo over. You couldn't float and keep your possessions. You had to do one or the other, or the water would come in and you would sink. That's a catch-22. Oh, my life is invested in that boat. My life is in the hold of that ship. But no, it's not. Your life is in your hands because you cannot swim and take the silver with you. It's impossible. It's catch-22. What are you going to do? Well, it's your money or your life. Or as somebody says when they rob you, your money or your wife. And the guy says, take my wife. No, I'm just joking. Your money or your life. The catch-22 is you need money to live. Yes, that's true. But if you accept the money, eventually you're going to drown and it's going to take your life. It's better to have your life and start over without anything than to lose your life by clutching on to the money and drowning. That's the snare you fall into. Your spiritual life, for all practical intents and purposes, is nil. You've drowned. It's done. The gold and silver is holding you at the bottom of the ocean, and you can't swim, and you've drowned. Now, look at Ecclesiastes chapter 5 and verse 10. Here's the kicker. Money, in all actuality, does not satisfy. He that loves silver shall not be satisfied with silver. If you have it, those that are avaricious only want more, if money is their God. Nor he that loves abundance with increase. This is also vanity. Okay, now, we're going to come to two types of souls in the Bible. One is a lean soul, and the other is a fat soul. And the Bible actually calls them such. Turn with me to Psalms 106. Now we're going to see how this is illustrated by the two types of souls. Now, this is the only place, having a fat soul, where you're not supposed to go on a diet. It's the only place. If you need to shed a few pounds, okay, you can go on a diet, but not with your soul. But if you have a lean soul, it's simply because you're trying to get. You're trying to acquire. You're trying to make yourself weightier, heavier, but it's an impossibility if silver becomes your God and the true God is left out of your life. Note Psalms 106, verse 14. They lusted exceedingly in the wilderness and tempted God in the desert. He gave them their request, but sent leanness to their soul. They had what they wanted by way of material possessions, but they didn't have prosperity of soul. I ask you the question, what's more important? What is more important? Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word proceeds out of the mouth of God. It's better to have a weightier soul. We'll call it portly. It's better to have a portly soul than it is to have all the possessions, everything that money can buy, and God not in your life. Now let me show you what they did. Psalms 78. They were fussing and complaining. No neighborhood McDonald's. No fast food restaurants. No place for food. All we have is this manna. And God said, all right, I'll send you pheasant. And so they collected their pheasants, began to eat. Verse 18, they tempted God in their heart by asking meat for their lust. Can you imagine? God sent them angel food, but instead of being content with what God sent their way, till they got to the promised land, a land of abundance, milk and honey, where God was going to multiply them and prosper them, they weren't satisfied. They just had to have it now. And they prayed according to their lust. And God said, boy, I'll tell you what, I can't do anything with these folks. I'll give them what they want. Verse 27. He rained flesh also upon them as dust, feathered fowl as the sand of the sea. And he let it fall in the midst of their camp and their habitations. And they did eat and were well filled, for he gave them up to their own desire. You see, it's the love of money. It's the love of things more than God. They were not estranged from their mouths. Now, please note, this is important, from their lust, rather. But while the meat was yet in their mouths, the wrath of God came and slew the fattest of them. Now, what does that mean? Just simply this. While they were eating the meat, they were looking around for more. They weren't content with what God sent them to simply take the bite and chew it and enjoy it. While the flesh was in their mouths, where can I go for more? They asked for food out of their lusts, and while they were eating, they were still lusting for more. Ecclesiastes 5:10. Silver does not satisfy. And a person who loves money, even though God keeps on advancing and prospering and so forth and blessing their lives, they're still not content with what God sends their way. They're eating of God's blessing and lusting after more. That's why the Apostle Paul says in 1 Timothy 6 that godliness with contentment is great gain. I mean, shouldn't you enjoy the bite that you have in your mouths first and swallow and taste it and see that God is good before you start looking for the second? But not them. They had a lean soul, even though they were stout on the outside, and they lusted. All right, now, what about the fat soul? Proverbs chapter 11. The lean soul is only interested in getting. He can be eating what he has earned, but he still wants more and more and more. Proverbs 11, verse 24. Now, note this. There is that scattereth and yet increases. Time and again, I have seen God proven in church. How in the world can you give away part of your salary? You've got to live on that. Yes, that's true. But I've seen him proven time and again. There is he that scatters the seed. And yet, it does what? It tends to increase. Yes, you scatter seed. Yes, you lose a little bit of yourself toward the will of God in your life, toward promoting the cause of Christ. But you know what happens? He increases it tenfold, 20-fold, 30, and on, accordingly. There is that scatters and yet increases, but now note, here's the lean soul. Here is the lover of money. It says, there is that withholds more than is meet. That money belonged to God, but you kept it. That money belonged to somebody else, but you finagled him out of it. You jewed him down. You did all of these things. You got it, and he got less, and you got better, and it's just simply because you got more through wrong means. You withheld more than is meet. But note, it tends to poverty. Where? In your soul. What kind of a God do you have? Again, that's why we emphasize the grace of God here. You do not see, every time you turn around, a pastor up here crying and giving some sob story and some poor-mouthing business. Oh, poor us, you don't hear that. Why? Because the grace of God cannot meet our needs by simply our working and trusting and praying and so forth. Phooey on that. Let's all make all we can all we get, and wait till the undertaker comes. We scatter, yet increase. Verse 25, the liberal soul shall be made fat. It emphasizes giving in its life, and God says that's fine. On the inside, you are prospered. You might not see as much as the guy down the street who has more but has a lean soul, but you've got it in your soul, and I will reward accordingly in eternity. Okay, let's go to another portion here. We've got just a few minutes, and like I said, we're going to look at this more for a couple more sessions. But I want to show you one more factor. Did you ever hear the old saying, what goes around comes around? Have you ever had it happen to you? Do you know where you got that? You got that in accordance with a Bible principle with regard to money. Now, let's take note here in Matthew chapter 7. Matthew chapter 7. Here is the verse. Now you'll note I've got scales here. And the reason that I've got scales is because this represents a just measure. In other words, that you actually get what you pay for and more. And I want you to note, this is about not being cheap. This is about a willingness to pay for craftsmanship. A willingness. Do you want to get a premium amount for your job? Then impersonal love must take over. The golden rule, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. If you are cheap and chintzy, yes, I want it when I do the work, but I don't want to give it out when you do the work. There's a factor here. What goes around comes around. This is not about being cheap. Now, we can be frugal and wise with regard to finances, but if it comes down to being cheap and chintzy, I want to warn all of us. Now, this is not a preaching time. This is teaching. So therefore, the teacher must understand that what's good for the goose is good for the gander as well. What goes around comes around. Verse number 2. For with what judgment ye judge, ye shall be judged. It is the law of lex talus in the Old Testament. Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. Well, what does that mean? Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. If you do not measure correctly to the other person, there will come a time in life when life does not measure the same to you. You'll be gypped. You'll be cheated. Verse 2 again. And with what measure ye meet, it shall be measured to you again. Now, let's go from here to Luke chapter 6. And with this verse, a little explanation, we'll come back and we'll see that a false weight, a false measuring stick, a false balance is an abomination to God, which just simply means that in all of these instances, somebody either is buying something from you and getting less what they pay for, or has done some work for you and you are not giving them their just due. And again, they can gouge you, but the point is here, you don't gouge them. Chapter 6, verse 38. What goes around comes around. Give. How? Liberally. It's the liberal soul that's prospered. It's the liberal soul that is made fat. It's talking about giving. You're scattering, you're giving part of yourselves, and yet you increase in your soul. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over. That's how you're supposed to give. Is that how you want people to treat you when you buy something? Or do you want them to have a false bottom? It says here a pint or a quart, but actually it has a false bottom and you don't get all that you pay for. Is that what you want? Absolutely not. What do you want? You want to get what you pay for. It must be a just balance, a just measure. Now, I want you to see something else. It's just not putting it in, it's pressing it down. It's compacting that, so you're sure of getting all. Shaken together, and then lastly, here is the tip, running over. Shall men give to your bosom? For with the same measure that ye meet withal, it shall be measured to you again. The phrase, what goes around comes around, has to do with your dealings with people in the realm of money. If you're covetous, if you commit the sin of avarice, if you love money more than righteousness and justice in your dealings with others with regard to money, just note, eventually, maybe not in this life, but definitely in the next, you're going to suffer the same amount, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth judgment in loss of your wealth and your reward.